working with your board to start planning beyond COVID-19. And I'd like to hand over to Managing Director for Oaks Consultancy, Luke, who's going to be chairing the session. Over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome everybody this afternoon. Apologies again for if people were ambushed at lunchtime. Normally it's an irritating networker we have to fear being ambushed by at lunch, not the kind of thing that happened today, so apologies for that. But yeah, this afternoon, I think as Beth just introduced, we're really here to talk about governance and actually how to reflect on how the sector has kind of managed during the crisis, how prepared it was, to reflect on some of the real lessons that we've learned throughout the last few months and beyond, and to really project forward, I think, to kind of hopefully pull out some bits of optimism and things to look to the future that we can take as a positive from what's happened and how we need to reflect and adapt into the future as well. So yeah, absolutely delighted today to be joined by two of the leading governance voices in the sector. So we've got Sunita Goddard-Patel, who's Head of Governance at Ormiston Academies Trust, and Sam Henson, who's Director of Policy and Information at the National Governance Association. So thank you both so much for being part of this today. Just before we start, it'd be great to just kind of hand over to you, perhaps just do a quick intro each on your background and your respective roles, and then we'll get straight into it. Maybe Sam, over to you first.
Do you want me to start? Yeah, great. Yeah, so I'm Sam Henson from the National Governance Association. I've been at the NGA for just over 5 years now, which has been a great experience working across the sector with different trusts, different schools. Our membership is very much covers MATs and single academy trusts and maintained schools, so we get a kind of a sector-wide perspective, and really we work with our members, providing them support, advice and guidance, but we also do a lot in terms of lobbying the government on various issues such as funding, and we've done quite a lot around MAT governance over the last few years as well. Last year we did a research report called Moving MATs Forward, so I might talk a bit about that in a moment or two, Luke, but yeah, I think it's a very wide-ranging experience at NGA, and yeah, really looking forward to this discussion here with you today.
Thank you, Sam. Sunita?
Hi, so I'm Sunita. I'm Head of Governance for Ormiston Academies Trust. So we have 40 schools across the country. They're all over the place, so we work with about 17 local authorities altogether. I look after school governance, so look after all of the governing bodies, but I also look after corporate governance. So I've been at Ormiston for about 3.5 years. Before that, I worked for a different MAT. And then before that, I was actually in governance at HE level, and I'm still involved in that. I'm on a trust board for a students' union at the moment. So actually, it's been really interesting to see sort of governance in the two sectors in the past few months, and sort of see the similarities and the differences in how things have operated. So hopefully I can draw on all that lovely experience from the past few months to share with you all today.
Fantastic, thank you both. So I guess I want to start, if I can, with you, Sam, with your kind of more holistic view of the sector. So I guess a pandemic like this is obviously really hard to predict and to see it coming. But in terms of being prepared for something like this, something of this magnitude to hit the sector, how well prepared do you think on the whole the sector was to kind of to react to something that I suppose we could describe as a crisis like this?
So that is an amazing first question. And not the easiest one to answer, I'm not going to lie, but I think that the sector as a whole has, I think it's worth firstly saying the sector as a whole has, you know, really pulled together at this time. And I think, you know, you've got people who perhaps weren't very much in the know about schools and the way that the school sector worked, that, you know, all of a sudden they know more about schools than that they've ever known before. You know, we've seen the the school sector at the forefront of the headlines, haven't we, over the last few months? And I think that for very good reasons, because actually this has impacted so many people in one way or another. I think that there's been a mixed response, I think, from different schools. I think actually what we have seen is particularly schools that and governing boards that are really kind of familiar with discussions around risk, have been very well prepared and have been really able to jump on that, and actually they've
Sorry, I can't hear you. Some of you think you've frozen.
I can't hear him either.
I think Sam's dropped out, unfortunately. I think he has frozen.
Okay, no problem. I'm sure we'll try and work on getting Sam back. So Sunita, I guess I was going to ask a similar question to yourself, particularly from your perspective, being on the inside with other and with the HE perspective as well. How did you guys feel, and how prepared did you feel that you were to kind of respond to the crisis?
I think overall as a sector, as Sam said, and I would absolutely echo that, everybody has just risen to the challenge nationwide. I think in terms of how prepared our trust board are, they're a very sort of well-oiled machine, and they've adapted really well. School governing bodies is slightly different because there's so many of them and there's such a broad spectrum of sort of capacity and ability across the trust. And I was worried actually, particularly in terms of things like virtual meetings and how to keep in touch with the school when they're not going to be there. Stereotypically, the demographic of governing bodies is older people who maybe aren't that familiar with technology. But again, I think everybody has just risen to the challenge, and I think I did think about this recently when I was thinking about sort of moving forward and how ready we are for the challenges that are still to come. And I think if you have a good governing body, whatever that looks like, the challenges aren't an issue because you've got that structure in place to keep going and to keep moving. And it doesn't matter how big the challenge is if you've got a well-oiled machine in terms of how you operate, because you just meet those challenges head on because you work together and you know where your strengths and weaknesses are, and you can be quite methodical in just how you handle any challenge that comes your way. So yes, it has been very different. There have been some sort of out at sea moments where governors have sort of thought there's no context or benchmarking for this situation. You know, how do I know if that attendance is good? What do I do now that I don't have proper exam results to compare on previous years? You know, that national picture and that broader context has been more difficult, I think, for governors to get a grasp of. But actually, I think that at a sector level, we've all been very good at sharing information with each other. And we as a trust have worked then with our governors to paint that wider picture and make sure that they are aware of the educational context. And we've done that through virtual briefing sessions and things like that. So I think we've actually handled the challenges quite well. If you'd have asked me 3 months ago if I was equipped for a pandemic, I would have said absolutely not. Please don't put me in that situation. But I think having come out of the other side, yes, there are definitely some learning points, but I think we've handled it as a sector as well as we possibly could.
Fantastic. And something you've kind of identified there, Sunita, I was going to ask about is that collaboration and how important that is. And have you noticed an improvement, an increase in the willingness and the level of collaboration across the sector since the pandemic? Yeah,
absolutely. So I sort of sit on a couple of different groups with other MAT leaders for governance, and they've been meeting more frequently. Those meetings have been really, really useful. There's been lots of sharing of best practice and stuff across the trust. Sector partners like CST and NGA have been sharing lots of sort of new documents that have been really quickly put together, and that's been, the support with that has been amazing as well. As I say, there's a lot of uncharted territory and sort of where, so for example, a few months ago now probably, no concept of time at the moment, I put together some exclusions guidance for virtual panel meetings because that's something that I lead on for my trust. Now, other heads of governance, it might not be at the forefront of their priorities, but then I can share that with them and that's that job done. But equally, they might look, I mean, Sam mentioned risk, and we've had some really good risk assurance frameworks be sent across to us that other trusts have worked on, because that's their priority. So I think that has been integral to the success, actually, the sector partnerships that have developed. I mean, it's not that they weren't there before, but they're definitely being better utilised. And we've all been meeting more frequently just because things are changing so quickly.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's really good to hear and really reassuring, I'm sure, for lots of people in the audience. So Sam, welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I perhaps just throw it back to you just to kind of finish your answer, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just kind of saying, I think those boards that were very familiar with that discussion around risk, I think were really well placed. And actually, I think one of the consequences of the last few weeks and months is actually it's very much put risk on the map for schools and trusts that perhaps weren't as familiar with it. And actually, you look at any other sector, and it's, you know, such a key part to organisational success. I think actually that's a good thing. And just on the point around collaboration, I think one thing we've really seen as well is a real renewed connection between the sector and local authorities, and that includes multi-academy trusts. I think one of the criticisms aimed at MATs in the past is they've not always engaged with LAs, and also likewise LAs haven't always engaged with MATs. And I think that, you know, whether there's truth in that or not, there's certainly been that perception, whereas I think actually what we've seen is MATs have very much been engaging with their local authority partners in a renewed way. So I think there's been a renewed perspective that's come out of this, which has been really positive.
Brilliant. Okay, great. So I guess what I wanted to focus on as well is a little bit in specific detail is around boards and how the boards specifically have responded to these to the challenges presented by COVID. And Sunita, to you, from your perspective, has it the dynamic shifted at all? Have you had, as you said, you probably had a really well-oiled machine already, so you're probably in a good position, but have you noticed a change in the dynamic of the relationship between the exec team and the board and how that operates?
Yeah, so with the trust board, they've been meeting more frequently, I would say, and I think it said in the brief for this session, they've definitely become more operational in the shorter term, and I think that's happening across all sectors, not just education. They have been in touch more sort of on an individual level, so our chair is having more regular catch-ups with the CEO. They are asking for more detail on sort of information that they previously wouldn't be interested in looking at, and that's because it's changed and they just want to know all of the sort of underlying support structures and things that are in place for the new systems that we're putting in place. I think we're going to talk about it a lot, but I think risk has come up a lot more than it had done previously because of the sort of associated liabilities of reopening schools and things like that. And schools trust boards, want to be absolutely assured that they're taking the right decisions when it comes to reopening schools. There's been a big focus on risk assessments and health and safety and all of those sorts of things that the board hasn't necessarily focused on before, but it's become sort of a key priority. In terms of school governors, as I say, I was a bit worried about virtual briefings, but they have really risen to the challenge, and actually the feedback on virtual meetings has been really positive. And we're finding that actually I think some of our governing boards will operate more virtually going forward. I think as a sector we need to be a little bit wary with virtual meetings. I mean, there's a temptation then to try and do everything online, but you want to make sure that you're still able to be in schools and feel the school culture and triangulate the things that you're being told in governing bodies. So I think the sort of next steps now in terms of how we move forward are making sure that we balance that quite carefully, and we don't just move everything online, because we're finding that in terms of getting the numbers and getting people to contribute, it's easier. I think that's sort of something that we need to be quite careful of. We've changed things like schedule of businesses for our governing body. We've given them different information to look at. We've told them all the sorts of things that they want to be asking their principal about. And as I say, we've done sort of virtual briefings on what the bigger and wider context is. So our CEO led a briefing for governors. I think I will be looking at our support systems and stuff that are in place. So at the moment we do a lot of face-to-face training, and I don't need to do that anymore. I can do a lot of that virtually. And I think that's going to be really positive in terms of the support that me and my team can offer to governors across the organisation. And we've also developed sort of new ways of working that can be reflected in a virtual environment, which I think is really useful.
Brilliant, brilliant. And Sam and Sunita picked up there on risk and how important that is, of course, at the moment, and trying to manage and mitigate risk as much as possible. I guess it's always a level of fear with an organisation, with a board, where you're trying to reduce the risk to as much a degree as you possibly can. Clearly, in the current environment, there's very little opportunity for whatever way forward is presented. There's risk at every turn. I suppose what would your advice be, or what would your read be on for a trust board or a governing board looking at how do they get to a decision about it? Because like I say, every decision will fill with some kind of risk. How do you get yourself to a point of confidence to say, well, this is the best way forward for us, and we've managed the risk as best as we possibly can?
Yeah, I think, again, a great question. I think actually there's been, rightly so, an element of fear from governing boards across the sector. You know, I think we've all been in a slightly fearful place over the last couple of months, so that's totally understandable. I think one of the things with risk is we often talk about it in a negative sense, but actually there's a positive sense, and with risk does come opportunity. So I do think actually as a result of boards embracing risk a bit more, then actually there is that chance to embrace opportunity a bit more. I think one of the conversations that's taken place over the last couple of months has been around liability issues of boards, and I think some boards have been worried about that. I think it's worth saying there, obviously that's a huge element of risk that they will be considering. I think it's worth saying though that actually if boards are taking account of that national guidance, and they are taking a very thought through, thorough approach to their risk assessment, and they're reviewing that risk assessment, I think actually it's very, very, very unlikely that whole liability issue is going to come back to bite them. And so I think it's worth stating that actually we shouldn't see risk as a one-off thing. It's not we didn't just do risk assessment to see if we could reopen our schools to more pupils. Actually there is a need to keep going with that and to review our risk assessment. Sunita will know more about that than me in terms of actually what it's been like in the day-to-day process, but I'm also a trustee, so I've been involved in that risk assessment on my own board, you know, and actually we a lot of that was down to having the confidence as a board that we knew the framework was right. And actually, you know, I'm very lucky in that the trust I'm a trustee for has a very, very able CEO who knows a lot and is well in tune with sector-wide voices, and I think that's important. I guess my slight concern would be where you have some trusts, maybe smaller trusts, that aren't as in the know, don't have as many kind of sector friends, so to speak. And I think that's really important. So again, it comes back to your point earlier, Luke, about collaboration. I think that's so important. We need to make sure we're sharing what we're learning. And actually, one of the things we can share and the trusts have shared is those frameworks for risk assessment. So yeah.
Brilliant. And those, if there are people in the audience who perhaps feel like they are in that position, that they perhaps don't know where to turn, they do want to just have some friends in the sector to kind of bounce ideas off, to check and challenge some of their thoughts, where would you recommend they kind of turn to first if they don't know perhaps where to head at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's lots of networks and stuff out there. I mean, NGA, we run one, a community map network. We're meeting next week actually. Dominic Henson there. I mean, go and talk to people like Sunita. Actually, Sunita might not thank me for that because I'm sure she's got enough work, but she won't mind. She's obviously there on the ground doing that work all the time. So I think actually having those conversations with actual trusts that of going through that experience, I think is really important. But there are lots of other places to go. Just I think it's just making sure that you're not trying to do it by yourself, and I think that's the key thing, really.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really important message, I think. Great. So I suppose clearly this has been the most kind of the most dominant topic for every single organisation across all sectors in the country for the last few months, and will be for the foreseeable future. How do you kind of balance that kind of practical dichotomy, that conflict between crisis management and that longer term strategic planning? So before this hit, everybody had their long term goals, their strategic plans they were working towards. I suppose we don't want to throw them out and just focus on the crisis management. How have you found it at the moment at Ormiston to think, right, we need to make this work in the short term, but we don't want to lose sight of our longer term aspirations as well? So how has a leadership team and its board has the organisation dealt with that kind of tension?
Yeah, so I think, so as I say, in terms of sort of day-to-day business, it has been definitely more operational. And I think what boards need to do next is sort of almost think about, and it's really difficult, isn't it? Because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if, you might be working for a small MAT that's going to go into local lockdown in September, and you're going to have to keep going with those operational meetings. But in theory, I think you need a timeline, really. And it doesn't have to be, by September. It could be at the point that we have had wider opening for a month. Actually, we're going to step back. We're not going to have as many meetings, and we're going to go back to looking at our longer-term plan. So I think it needs to be sort of scenario-based rather than physical timings. But I also think that as a result of meeting more frequently, and I know that I've definitely found this on the meetings that I've attended, because I'm meeting more frequently, I am seeing the gaps and things, because you've got the threads and you're holding them a little bit tighter than maybe you normally do, because you have a meeting and then you go away for a couple of months and you maybe don't communicate with your school that much, and then you go back in and you think, oh, I feel like we should have done something about that, but it's been too long. I think those gaps are really obvious at the moment. So we have looked at risk as an organisation because we don't think that we're tight enough on that, and this has really highlighted that. So I think while you have that strategic bigger picture that you were working towards, that has probably changed, and I think your focus will have changed as a result of that. But I also think this is a really good time for you to sort of take stock, because you are meeting more regularly. Those issues have been highlighted, and you can still have those longer term things, but it might be that you're looking more at your operation as a board, what information you look at as a board, how you structure your meetings, because you'll have sort of changed and you'll have different perspectives now. So I think that strategic longer term thinking will definitely change, and now is a good time to think about how you're going to address that in the longer term. I also think you might have, having looked more closely at things, noticed things that you weren't aware of, that you should be monitoring at board level. So you might want to have a look at things like your CEO report and the information that you have been used to be receiving in that, and then in the past couple of months you've sort of said, well, we haven't really looked at that before, we haven't been tracking that previously, but now in this crisis it's a priority for us, so perhaps we should be looking at that all the time. So I think there's lots of lessons to be learned here, and sort of take this time to take stock of all those lessons learned and put your strategy and your strategic objectives, I think, as a board will have, perhaps not as an organisation, but as a board and in terms of how you operate, will have changed in the longer term. And I think this is a good time to reflect on that.
Absolutely. Sam, what's your take?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Sunita said. I mean, I think one of the key things that we've been saying recently is that actually there will be a need for all organisations within the school sector to go back to what their vision is and actually think about that. And actually, so much has changed in the last couple of months, and there are some real specific issues. I mean, the one that I think is on a lot of people's mind at the moment is the way this pandemic has impacted disadvantaged pupils. And you know, that is huge, and actually, you know, the whole definition around disadvantage is up for discussion. And you know, we've seen announcements from the government about catch-up funding and so on. And so, you know, as a direct result of that, the strategic conversations for the board are going to need to change. So it's not necessarily a case that all of the priorities are suddenly going to be radically different, but actually you're going to need to go back to your plans and think about it. And I think that does mean going back to your actual vision and thinking about, actually, is our vision ambitious enough, and that can it cope with where we are now? And you know, we would encourage boards to look at their vision on an annual basis anyway, but actually thinking about how inclusive your vision is at this point in time, I think is really important. Yeah, and I also think that what we need to make sure is that the boards themselves have a bit of space to have a strategic conversation. Like you were saying, Sunita, there's been so much in terms of the operational recently. Actually, it's really important that as we approach September, that there is a bit of space given over to that, to ramping up that strategic conversation, and making sure actually boards have a chance to ask those key questions. And I think the key thing there is, as well, that includes all of the whole board. Recently, there's been an awful lot of work done by CEOs and chairs, perhaps slightly less from other members of the board. I think actually something that's been reported to us by numerous members is that there's been an increase in chairs action that's been taken, which you completely understand. But I think going forwards into September, we need to make sure there is an effort to bring the entire board back into those strategic conversations.
Yeah, absolutely, brilliant. So I think we've focused a lot on some of the challenges so far. Let's flip it into some of the positives, some of the silver linings that have come out of this. So I think we touched on a few already around definitely increased collaboration across the sector, perhaps improved relationships at some points between execs and boards. Sunita, what's the big positive takeaway from this that we think that will actually help us long term as a sector to have improved and stronger governance?
I think one of the biggest things for me is probably better communication, because we're a map that is sort of really spread out. When we go to school meetings or academy meetings, we all of us have to travel quite a long way. And this pandemic, for everybody, you know, all those people that said, I don't know how to work Teams, like, they know how to use it now. Magically, everybody knows how to use Teams now. So I think that has been really helpful. Like, I know that my executive team, I've seen more of them in the past 3 months than I probably did in the 3 years that I worked for O previously, because we're having catch-ups twice a week. And I think it's the same with everybody. You know, governors are more inclined to do training sessions together and things, because it's just easier to get onto virtual meetings and integrate that into your day without having to take lots of time out. And I think that's really strengthened relationships. I think for governors, it's really strengthened their understanding of how their academy works, and sort of the kinds of things that their academy is doing on a day-to-day basis. A huge positive for me, which I think we really need to not lose and we really need to build on, is the links that schools have made with families and parents in particular, particularly schools that have been operating in disadvantaged areas and have had a huge amount to do with free school meals. Parents are really grateful for that. I think people who are homeschooling their children at the moment have a newfound respect for teachers. So I think as a country, people are going to be more appreciative of schools. They're going to be more willing to engage with schools. And I think in terms of governance, that works really well. You know, something that we really push at OAT is stakeholder engagement. So I would want schools to try and build on that. I'd want governors to try and get out and meet with parents, because that's a real hard to reach group for us. But also in terms of things like getting governors, now that, you know, people at home have understood what teachers do and how hard that job is, you might find that they're more willing to give back now and volunteer to be governors in your area. So I think it's been massive, hasn't it? It's been a huge change, but I do think the sort of communication and just reach of academies with the community, but also internally, has just changed things really drastically and hopefully better.
Definitely. Sam?
Yeah, I think one of the really encouraging things that I think has happened is we've seen a lot of MATs out there that have kind of really flexed their governance structures and done things quite differently. And actually, you know, that's something that freedom's been there for a long time, but actually on the ground in practice it's quite hard. It's not always been that easy for MATs to kind of suddenly switch up the way they do things, because there's so many considerations. And you know, you try telling a local governing body, for example, that you're going to do something different, it doesn't always go down that well, and it's quite hard to do. Whereas I think actually the last couple of months has given MATs a very legitimate reason for doing things differently, and people have understood, and actually it's given those people at a local level a chance to see how doing things differently can work. And that has increased, I think, in lots of cases, that community engagement and that stakeholder engagement. And I think that's really positive. I also think this goes right back to the point right at the beginning that Sunita was making, is that actually the whole virtual governance point is actually something, again, we shouldn't lose that. And yeah, I think it's really important that we don't go down the route of no one ever kind of meeting face to face and there never being any sort of physical presence, you know, at schools anymore or whatever. There's still a need for visibility, but actually we can mix things up, we can do things differently. It will mean that some people who are really keen to volunteer their time can now find that they've got more routes to do that. And that might not mean that they do all meetings virtually, but they can do the odd meeting here and there virtually, which means actually it's much more accessible for them, which I think is really important. So I actually think, although it's been a really, really difficult time, and it still is, you know, and this is nowhere near over, actually, like you say, Luke, there are some real positives, and we need to make sure we're not losing those.
For sure, absolutely. It's really important to sustain all the positives we take from this into the future. I'm just gonna pause for a couple of audience questions that have come in. So I might go for one each. So Sam, one question here we've got is, are boards at risk of board fatigue, given how overwhelming the recent crisis has been? How can we keep them engaged and manage their capacity? I guess it's a really interesting question, because yeah, a lot of board members who sign up have a certain expectation of how much time is going to be required, and then when the crisis hits, all of a sudden there's a lot more need for that operational involvement. So yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, a great question. I think it will be different for everyone, won't it? I think different boards have different experiences, and like I was saying earlier, some boards have not met that much or not done that much during this time. Others have been really, really involved. So it's really hard to give an answer that covers everyone, but I think actually there is a need to kind of take a step back and assess where you're at as a board. And so I would say it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. And actually there is a bigger point here around governance workload, something we're really keen to raise that issue. And actually I would really we really want the government and others to take more seriously the role of our volunteers in the school sector, because they play such a crucial role and do so much, and we need to show a greater appreciation. I think that will help, and I know it would be patronising to suggest that that's gonna solve the governor workload issue. It won't, but actually I think getting it out there what trustees and governors actually do, making people aware of that, I think is really really key, and then we can actually get more people on board. And I think if we get more people on board, then actually we can spread the workload out a bit more. And the other thing I'd add to that, Luke, is that actually it's really keen that it's really absolutely key that we make sure our boards are diverse. They're not just a group of like-minded individuals that all think the same thing. You know, we need to get different people from different corners of society, from across you know, each community involved, and we need to get those viewpoints in. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and that is a perfect segue into our next question, actually. Sunita, and I think it's a really crucial point. And yeah, the question, which I'll paraphrase, is effectively how can we take some of the learnings we talked about, some of the adapted new ways of working, and perhaps being a bit more agile, having more digital engagement with boards. Does that help in terms of aiding the push for more diversity and trying to recruit people from different backgrounds, from different age profiles, more diverse backgrounds to actually join boards? And will that assist that process? And then I suppose B, and the bigger question is, more fundamentally, what do we need to do as a sector to kind of help increase the level of diversity that's being represented, particularly at leadership levels?
Okay, this is a really big question, but definitely a question that needs to be asked, and a question that I do push actually in my organisation and sort of wherever I can. Diversity is definitely an issue. And I think, yes, to answer the first part of the question, moving things to a sort of digital platform does make it more accessible, make governing bodies more accessible and trust boards more accessible to a wider audience. But actually, I don't actually know if that's the problem anyway. I don't know if it is sort of reaching more people in terms of just the numbers. I think it's specifically targeting those groups of people. And I think as a sector, we're not very good at that. We are very good at sort of the male-female split. We're not very good at the Black, Asian and minority ethnic split, and sort of other minorities that should be considered on boards and just aren't. We're also not great at representing younger people. So one of the things I've tried to push with my boards is to try and get student voice involved and ask your alumni to get involved, you know, your younger people who have experience of the school. But I don't think it's as straightforward as, now that we're working virtually and we've got a bigger reach, we will find those people. I think it has to be quite targeted and quite specific, that we go and find, and that can be targeted advertising, can't it? It doesn't have to be just, we'll put it out to more people, we'll make it more accessible in terms of putting it online. So then ultimately we probably will find someone. I think you specifically have to go and look for those people, and you have to target your advertising and your recruitment drives at those groups of people that you want represented on your board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's more fundamental points around the culture of the organisation, to why we're not attracting those people in the first place, and what do we need to change, rather than just attracting people who are going to apply. It's about how do we fundamentally change that culture, isn't it? Yeah. Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'd add is around that culture point, full stop. Actually, it's not easy to kind of go in as the fresh face in a governing board, particularly, you know, some governing boards have been, you know, there's people there that have been governing there for a long time. They know each other very well. There's kind of very set practices. It's quite hard. You know, I've certainly been in that experience, that situation myself, where you go in your first governing board meeting. You're desperate to contribute in a meaningful way, but it's not always easy. So I think actually there is a need for all boards to kind of think about how accessible they're making their boards to new voices, other voices. I think that's really key. If we end up with the same voices, you know, over years and years and years, then actually we can very easily miss things, and that's where that kind of rot can set in organisations sometimes, and we need to avoid that. So yeah, I think there's a need for boards to kind of be very proactive in reviewing their culture as a board and the behaviours of the board as well. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Another question has come in for you, Sunita, around stakeholder engagement. So what checks and measures do you recommend for inclusive and thorough mapping?
For inclusive and thorough what? Sorry, you cut out.
Stakeholder mapping.
Right, so what we do at the end of, so about this time of the year, we ask our governors, we do a skills audit in the second term, and then in the third term, we ask them to look at their training and development plan. They look at their academy development plan and their skills audit, and they use their training and development plan to focus on filling the gaps on the skills audit, but also how they are going to tailor their stakeholder engagement to the priorities on the academy development plan. So say, for example, you're going to focus on Year 8 SEN boys. And then you've got your other priorities, but we'll just take that one priority for now. You decide who on your governing body is going to focus on that and when. You know, you might have 3 priorities altogether. You decide as a group you're going to focus on one per term, or 3 of you are going to focus on one for the year, 3 of you are going to focus on another 3 on another. And then you also decide how you're going to engage with everybody involved in that group. So you're going to speak to some parents of some Year 8 SEN boys, you're going to speak to some Year 8 SEN boys themselves, and you're also going to speak to some staff who speak to that group of students. And you as a governing body decide how you're going to approach that. So yeah, like I say, you know, you allocate the communications to whichever governor, and at your governing body meetings you put your training and development plan on the agenda, and you give an update on what you've done, you personally as a governor have done on stakeholder engagement since the last meeting, in line with the training and development plan, and that will be tracked in your minutes. You'll also have done a monitoring visit report, because you'll have met with that group of people and you've done the formal report, and you'll sort of verbally just feedback at the governing body meeting as well. And then any training that you've done in relation to that, so you might do some SEN training before you even embark on that in September, you track that on your training log.
Fantastic, really thorough, thank you. I'm conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left, so any other questions, please send them in now while we can. So there's a question for you around accountability, actually, and I think around what true accountability means in the sector, and a question: do you think there's enough accountability at board level across maths academies and schools, and do you think there's enough kind of external scrutiny on organisations and how they're managing their governance operations at the moment? And if not, what can we do to improve that?
Yeah, great. I think it's really helpful when we're talking about accountability to strip it right back and think about what we actually mean. For me, it's that answerability, isn't it? And making sure we can actually give our stakeholders the answers they're looking for. And actually the crucial thing there is that we are answerable to our pupils, because they're the ones that we essentially exist for. Everyone in the education sector exists for them. So I think that's really important. So for me, it's about always making sure we're very much focused on our pupils, and it's surprisingly easy to kind of lose track sometimes of that. And I guess especially in sector-wide discussions and debates, we often stroll into things like structures and whatnot, and we forget to go back to that. So I think that's really key. I think in terms of thinking about how accountability can work in the structures that we have at the moment, actually we need to think about the channels and the means of communication that we have. I think actually in maths in particular, actually the vast majority of maths will have a local tier of governance in some way or some form or another, or actually a local tier, I should say, because they're not always governing. But actually making sure you're using that as part of your key accountability channels, I think is really important. I think the other key thing that I would want to say is around actually that kind of sector-wide accountability and the role of the likes of Ofsted and the DFE, the SFA. Actually, it's really key, I think, that those organisations are always making time for governance at a local level, governance at a trust level, and actually that means being very aware of what governance is, what it seeks to do, and appreciating that. So for Ofsted, for example, I think that means when inspectors come in, whenever inspections resume, that inspectors do have a real discussion around the 3 core functions of governance, and actually making time for that. And they're not just relying on the MAT executives to get their view on governance. Actually, they're talking to the people that are doing it themselves. So that's the trustees, that's the governors at a local level. So I think having that trust-wide discussion is really important.
Brilliant. I think we've probably got time just for one last question from the audience, which happens to be quite a good one to end on, actually. And I'll ask it to both of you, but I'll start with you, Sunita. So could you share your vision for recovery? What are your hopes for the sector this time next year?
I think that's a big question as well, isn't it? I mean, we've only got 4 minutes and Sam's got 2 of those. I think I want to do more working online. So something that I will be working with my governors on next year is how I can better support them doing virtual briefings and lots more things online in terms of training and support and things like that. I am hoping that for me personally, in our trust, we're going to be better at risk, because I think that's something that's been highlighted by the pandemic for us. I've referenced several times today. Risk is important, guys. Don't know if you've got that today. But also, as I said, in sort of all of the things that have come across as the positives, to have built on relationships that we've built with parents throughout this time, and hopefully have sort of embedded a stronger sense of community between governors, the school staff, the students, parents, and the wider community. So I think it would be really positive if in the next 12 months we can build on all of those things that we've identified as sort of silver linings of the pandemic, so that we're in a stronger position in terms of community operation in 12 months' time.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sam?
I would really love to see us as a sector really build on that wider sense of collaboration that has happened. We've got more trust, speaking to more trust than ever before, which I think is really important. We need to make sure we don't go backwards. I think actually that communication that Sunita was talking about, that's really improved a trust to trust level, and within a trust is really important that we carry on that momentum. So I really hope that in a year's time actually we've really stuck with those things, and we don't revert back to a system where you've got the trust over here doing their own thing and not engaging with anyone else, and actually trust speaking to each other. I think that's great. So let's keep that up.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So I think, yeah, guys, thank you so much for your contribution today. I think it's been a really actually uplifting conversation, and there's been so many positives to take from that. I think I've just tried to capture some of the key messages that have come out throughout the whole conversation, and absolutely right from the start, collaboration, how it's improved. We need to maintain that as a sector and keep that going. Improved awareness, Sunita, and management of risk is definitely something that's come through, and that's something that needs to continue to be at the top of the agenda for boards and governing bodies across the sector as well. I think that understanding that we can work in a bit more of an agile way and be a bit more flexible and adapt the way we approach operational matters has been something that the whole country's learned, but particularly in the sector. And yeah, I think clearly still a lot more to be done on the issue of diversity and trying to improve and increase the levels of diversity across the sector, but definitely some positive steps in that area, but a lot more to be done. So yeah, guys, thank you so much once again. I'm sure the audience is giving you a virtual round of applause now, and we really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you for the questions that came through. Yeah, it's been a really enjoyable hour. So thank you to Sunita and Sam.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Sam. Yes, just to absolutely echo that. I can say behind the scenes, people felt very inspired and very in awe of some amazing comments that were coming out. Like Luke said, on the more, I guess, on the more important comments, you made some fantastic ones around, is your vision ambitious enough? Which I feel like I need to wake up every morning wondering if my vision is ambitious enough. That's a fantastic statement. But equally on the slightly less informal, magically everyone knows how to use Teams now. Debatable, Sunita. Some people who can use it very well and some people who can use it not so well. I'm probably on that other category. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you, Luke, for hosting and sharing.